Welcome to this explainer. Close your eyes for a second and imagine stepping into the completely decimated, smoldering ruins of Berlin in July of 1945. The air is literally still thick with ash. The most destructive war in human history has just ended in Europe, and three men have converged on a place called the Sicilian Hof Palace. They're ostensibly there to build a lasting peace, but, spoiler alert, instead they're about to lay the structural groundwork for a 50-year global standoff. Today, we're going to reconstruct those incredibly tense weeks at the Potsdam Conference. We'll look at a moment where the outcomes were entirely unknown, the risks were absolutely existential, and every single decision carried a consequence that would go on to fundamentally reshape our modern world. To truly get the atmosphere inside that room, you've really got to look into the minds of the men holding the pen. Take a look at this incredibly apocalyptic diary entry from U.S. President Harry S. Truman. It perfectly illustrates the almost incomprehensible psychological stakes at play here. You see, Truman had just gotten word of the successful Trinity test in New Mexico. That one single terrifying piece of knowledge completely transformed what was supposed to be a diplomatic peace conference into a high-stakes psychological thriller. And to understand that palpable tension at Potsdam, we have to grasp just how incredibly fast the world was shifting beneath their feet. Back in February at the Yalta Conference, the Allies were tightly united by sheer military necessity. But fast forward to April, FDR is dead. May, Germany surrenders. And by July, the atomic bomb is a terrifying reality. In literally less than half a year, the wartime glue that held the Grand Alliance together completely dissolved. Which brings us to our first major shift, the change in guard and the fragile alliance. With Germany's unconditional surrender removing that one common existential threat they all shared, the leadership dynamics changed practically overnight. The men who orchestrated the war were no longer the same men negotiating the peace. You had an untested Harry Truman, a newly elected Clement Attlee of Britain, and they're facing off against a deeply entrenched, highly paranoid Joseph Stalin. Without a common enemy, this wasn't a grand alliance anymore. It was three rival empires eyeing each other with deep mutual suspicion across the absolute ruins of Europe. Now, amidst all this suspicion, there was really only one completely non-controversial baseline that everyone could agree on. They were absolutely unanimous in their mandate to dismantle the Nazi war machine from the ground up. They agreed to the 3 Ds: denazify, demilitarize, and democratize, basically purging officials and destroying weaponry. But, once they moved past those basic elements, the facade of unity began to seriously crack. And that cracking leads us right into the geographic cleave. Any superficial cordiality in that room evaporated the exact moment these leaders attempted to redraw the physical map of Eastern Europe. A perfect example is the Oder-Neisse line. When Soviet troops pushed through Poland to defeat Germany, Stalin effectively just annexed Polish territory in the east. So to compensate Poland, the Allies agreed to push Poland's borders westward, directly into what used to be German territories. But this wasn't just moving abstract lines on a piece of paper, right? This was Stalin effectively securing a permanent strategic sphere of influence. And the human consequence of that newly drawn line was absolutely harrowing. 9 million. That is the number of ethnic Germans who were subjected to a brutal, forced expulsion from those redrawn territories. Think about that for a second. This wasn't some slow, natural demographic shift. It was an overnight, monumental uprooting of millions of human lives. The official diplomatic language drafted at the conference called for orderly and humane transfers. But the grim reality on the ground was a far cry from that sanitized rhetoric. Local authorities frequently gave families a mere 10 to 30 minutes to evacuate. We're talking about the elderly, the sick, and infants being uprooted, allowed to carry maybe 20 kilograms of belongings if they were lucky, and just shoved out into a fractured world with zero food or medical care. So the physical map was changing, but so was the financial one. Let's look at the economic fracture. The debate over economics at Potsdam is arguably what permanently broke the whole concept of a unified Germany. It was a fundamental clash of sheer survival strategies. Stalin was desperate. He demanded incredibly heavy reparations and the total deindustrialization of Germany to rebuild his own decimated country. Truman, on the other hand, was terrified of repeating the economic collapse of the 1920s, so he flat out refused. He was deeply worried that American taxpayers would ultimately end up footing the bill for Germany's starvation. The deadlock was absolute. So, as a desperate compromise, Truman essentially told Stalin he could extract reparations, but primarily from his own eastern occupation zone. The Soviets were granted permission to extract a staggering $10 billion in industrial wealth directly from their controlled territory. But here is the absolutely crucial takeaway from that decision. By linking those reparations to unilateral extraction within distinct military zones, the Allies accidentally destroyed the very principle of a unified German economy. They tied the Eastern Zone firmly to the Soviet command economy and the Western zones to the capitalist system. Without even intending to, the men sitting in that palace laid the structural, economic foundations for the Iron Curtain, totally preventing the free movement of goods, men, and ideas. Which sets the stage for arguably the most dramatic moment of the entire conference, the atomic whisper. So behind all these intense geopolitical calculations, a single piece of mind-blowing intelligence was burning a hole in Truman's pocket. He had just received word that a 13-pound explosive had literally vaporized a 60-foot steel tower in the New Mexico desert. Imagine a cinematic tension on the afternoon of July 24th. The plenary session wraps up. Truman casually walks around the large circular table, approaches the Soviet premier, without an interpreter, mind you, and quietly whispers that the United States now possesses a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Eyewitnesses, including Winston Churchill, who was standing just 5 yards away, were watching breathlessly. They were desperate to measure the effect of this monumental revelation on Stalin. But Stalin? He remained chillingly placid. He offered zero questions, showed absolutely no shock, and simply stated he was glad to hear of it and hoped they would make good use of it against the Japanese. Truman actually walked away from that exchange, thinking Stalin simply didn't comprehend the magnitude of what he had just been told. But we really have to ask ourselves, why didn't one of the most famously paranoid leaders in human history react to the ultimate existential threat? Well, to understand this psychological duel, we have to look past the negotiating table and into the shadows of international espionage. Stalin didn't blink because he already knew. Soviet intelligence networks had been deeply infiltrating the Manhattan Project, funneling highly classified data about the atomic bomb straight to Moscow since the fall of 1941. He played it completely straight. And that quiet, terrifying exchange in a German palace essentially marks the true birth of atomic diplomacy. And so, we enter the dawn of the Cold War. As the conference closed in early August, the consequences of those tense weeks radiated outward, completely sealing the fate of the Pacific. The US, Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration. This was a massive political ultimatum demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction. When Japan rejected it, that decision directly paved the way for the unprecedented devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki just days later. When you step back and look at the whole global paradigm shift, the ultimate tragedy of the Potsdam Conference becomes crystal clear. Think about it. A summit explicitly designed to secure a just and enduring peace achieved the exact opposite. It took a grand alliance bound by military dependence and replaced it with a polarized, partitioned, nuclear-armed world driven entirely by mutual suspicion and atomic threats. Which leaves us with this final lingering thought. As you look around today at the borders, the economic rivalries, and the nuclear anxieties that continue to define our current reality, you really have to wonder, did the peacemakers at Potsdam actually end a world war? Or did they simply use the smoke-filled rooms of a ruined palace to write the terrifying rules of engagement for the next half-century?